The river ran like melted glass beneath the hooves of Luther Rainhorse's mare, slick with morning light and danger. He didn't need a rifle aimed at him to feel the tension it lived in the current, in the heat pushing against the back of his neck, and in the way the land whispered of trouble long before a soul spoke it. He had crossed rivers like this before, each time thinking he could leave everything behind on the far bank. But this morning, something shifted. A figure stood midstream, small, unmoving, and barefoot. Luther reined in. His mare jerked in protest, unsure whether to spook or freeze. The boy didn't move. Water lapped at his knees. His hands, too small to do any damage, gripped the leather reins with a stubbornness that stopped a grown man and beast in their tracks. "Sir," the boy said, voice tight with effort. "If you ride on, they'll take my mama." The child's eyes were wide and brown, wild but clear. Not begging, just believing, the kind of belief that doesn't shake even when everything else does. Luther's first instinct was to yank the reins back and ride through. Not because he was heartless, but because he had learned too well what happened when he did stop. 3 years ago, he had stopped. 30 seconds too late, and his brother bled out in his arms for the price of it. He hadn't worn a badge since. Easy, Luther said to the mare, steadying her. Then to the boy, calm and low, let go. "You're gonna get yourself killed standing in front of a horse. Not till you say you'll help." "Help how?" the boy's voice cracked. "Judge Matheson's coming. Monday, says Mama can't keep me, says a woman can't raise a boy on land she can't keep clean." Luther's mouth went dry. The name Matheson twisted something in his gut. He'd heard it before too many towns ago. "And where's your pa dead? 2 years now." The boy's throat worked. "Mama says the mine poisoned him." Luther looked upstream. A red smear stained the ridge in the distance tailings, piled like scars, where the Darrington Mining Company carved metal from the earth and dumped what they didn't want into the river like the land meant nothing. "You got a name, Benji 2 Rivers. You're out here alone, Benji." The boy shook his head. "Copper's with me." A skinny brown dog stood on the far bank, tail tucked, barking low. The sound wasn't fierce, it was worried. Luther exhaled slow. "Son, I'm just passing through. Looking for feed and a place to rest a spell." "You got hands," Benji said, eyes fierce now. "Mama says what we need ain't charity, it's help fixing what a man broke." The river pressed around the boy's legs, but he stood rooted like a sapling in floodwater. A man can ride past a lot of things. Dying towns, drunken preachers, lost causes, but a barefoot child in a river begging for his mother that stops you, even when you know it shouldn't. Luther spat into the water. "Where's this ranch up the hill?" 10 minutes, maybe less. "I ain't promising nothing. You said you'd look." Benji's grip loosened. "That's all I said, and that's enough." The boy turned, sloshed back to the bank, scooped up the dog, and started up the trail without checking to see if Luther followed. But he did. He told himself it was just curiosity. A few fence posts, a leaky roof, nothing that would hold him down. He was done with towns, with needing people and being needed back. But still he followed. The trail climbed through scrub and pine, the air hot already despite the hour. Dust rose from each hoofstep as they crested the final ridge. Luther saw the problems before he saw the people. Fence lines sagged like tired bones. A barn leaned so far to one side it seemed to sigh. Weeds choked out what had once been a vegetable garden, now barely hanging on. But the house itself, rough-hewn timber and weather-worn windows, stood upright. Curtains fluttered, a clean porch, a rusted horseshoe nailed to the beam above the door. Someone was fighting to keep this place from sinking into the dirt. The front door creaked open before Benji reached it. A woman stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, not aimed but not lowered either. She looked to be in her early 30s, maybe younger beneath the sun-worn skin. Auburn hair pulled back, streaked with gray eyes, sharp and wide-set. "Samuel Benjamin 2 Rivers," she said, voice steady. "I didn't do nothing, Mama." She lowered the rifle just a hair. "You brought a man back from the river. He can help. I told you not to ask strangers." "I didn't ask. I told. Papa said there's a difference." Her gaze shifted to Luther. And just like that, everything about her sharpened. Not angry, just assessing, calculating, like a mother bear measuring threat. "Ma'am," Luther said, tipping his hat. "Your boy flagged me down. He talks too much. He talks right enough. I don't need fixing. I don't take charity. Wasn't offering it. I'm headed north, looking for a week's work. Trade fence, mending for food, and a dry place to sleep." She hesitated. The dog Copper stood at her heels, ears up, tail twitching. "1 week," she said finally. "You sleep in the barn. You eat what we eat. You touch a drop of whiskey or raise your voice to my son and I will shoot you. Fair deal. The name's Maggie. Luther Rainhorse." She nodded once. "Get your horse tied. I'll show you the fence line." Benji grinned wide. "Told you, Mama. He's the one." Maggie turned to go inside. "God didn't send him, Benji. You ambushed him in a river." "There's a difference," the boy muttered. But as she stepped through the door, Luther caught something flicker in her expression. Not quite relief. Not yet trust. But close enough to make a man pause. He dismounted, tied his mare to the last standing post, and took off his gloves. Sun beat down. The barn's shadow stretched long and lean, and something in his chest shifted, small but sure, like the sound of a nail driving clean into wood. Behind him, Maggie's voice called out, "Post line runs south, start there." Luther rolled up his sleeves. "Yes, ma'am." Benji darted ahead with Copper trailing. They worked until the sun sagged low. The boy handed him water with pride eyes, never straying far. "You ever have a kid?" Benji asked. Luther's hands stilled on the fence. "No." "You ever want one? I had a brother. Raised him." "What happened to him?" Luther drove the post in harder than needed. "He's gone." Benji didn't push, just nodded. "My papa's gone too. But Mama says gone don't mean forgotten." Luther looked toward the house. Inside, Maggie was moving supper maybe, or sorting through the ghosts her husband left behind. "Your mama's right," he said. Benji smiled. "She usually is." Luther reached for the next post hands, steady. "For now. I don't need saving," Maggie said, rifle steady in her hands. "But I won't be shamed into losing my son." She stood like granite on the porch, the last of the sun turning her face into copper and shadow. The rifle rested loosely in her arms now, but Luther Rainhorse had seen enough of life to know it wouldn't take much for her to raise it again. She hadn't invited him to her land, hadn't wanted a man poking around, and still didn't trust that he hadn't come to take something instead of help. Luther had tied his mare to the upright fence post and was already mending the next when Maggie's voice rang out again. "I don't care how many boards you fix. This isn't a pity job." "Wasn't planning on pity," he said, without looking up. "I mean it. Folks pass through, see a widow, and her son think they're doing a good deed by swinging a hammer or shoveling some muck. Then they disappear before breakfast. I ain't those folks. You ain't the first to say that either." Luther drove a nail in with 2 solid strikes and finally looked up at her. "Then give me a week and judge after." Maggie narrowed her eyes, weighing something. Not the fence, not even him. But whether the presence of another adult on her land would cost her more than the loneliness already did. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Benji's face peeked through. Mama, supper's ready. She didn't take her eyes off Luther. He can eat on the porch. Luther nodded. I don't mind barn fare. You'll get a plate. I'll earn it. She turned without a word and stepped inside. The house smelled of cornbread onions and the kind of tired that seeps into floorboards. Luther stood at the basin behind the barn and scrubbed his hands in cold water, dried them on his trousers, and made his way to the porch steps. Benji had already set 3 chipped enamel plates on a crate they used as a table. Copper. The dog lay beneath it, ears perked tail thumping against the porch slats when Luther sat down. Don't feed him scraps, Maggie warned as she emerged with a steaming pot. He gets enough from Benji when I'm not looking. Benji gave the dog a guilty glance. He earns 'em. Don't we all, Luther muttered. The food was simple salt pork, boiled potatoes, and a hunk of the densest cornbread Luther had ever bitten into. But it was hot clean and made by hand. He'd eaten worse with better men. Maggie sat across from him, back straight fork, moving with mechanical precision. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Benji filled the silence with small talk. How Copper chased a raccoon up a pine the week before, how one of the hens laid a blue-speckled egg that morning, how the barn used to hold more horses before everything changed. When Benji mentioned the mine, Maggie's fork paused mid-air. They're still dumping upstream, the boy said, not looking up. Water tastes like tin now. Maggie set the fork down slowly. Eat your beans, Benji. It's true. I said eat. Benji looked at Luther. You ever taste metal in water? Sometimes, Luther said. Usually means something's wrong. Maggie's eyes flashed. Means folks should stop talking about what they can't prove. Benji's shoulders fell, but Papa said enough. Silence again. Even Copper stopped thumping his tail. Luther chewed slowly, letting the heat of the beans spread through his chest. When they finished, Maggie gathered the plates without a word and vanished inside. The door slapped shut behind her. Benji stayed. She don't like to talk about Papa, he said quietly. I noticed. She reads his notebooks every night. Thinks I don't see. She's trying to hold on, Luther said. People grieve in pieces. Some get stuck in one. Benji scratched behind Copper's ears. She won't say it, but she's scared. The judge comes Monday. Judge Matheson. The boy nodded. He says a woman with land she can't manage can't raise a boy proper. Luther leaned back on his hands. You look properly raised to me. Papa taught me everything before he got sick. Luther didn't speak. The sun had dipped low, and the evening air cooled just enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. You really gonna stay a whole week? Benji asked. I said I would. Mama don't believe you. I don't blame her. Benji stood and dusted his hands. If you leave, I hope you tell her first. Luther's gaze followed the boy's retreating figure into the house. The screen door shut gently this time. He finished his coffee, burnt and strong, and walked to the barn. The stall was swept, a clean blanket laid in the corner. Not a welcome, just preparation. He lay down, arms behind his head, and stared at the slats in the ceiling. Moonlight filtered through in thin silver lines. The scent of hay sweat and earth filled the space. From the house, a light still burned. He could just make out Maggie's silhouette moving behind a curtain. She was reading Daniel's journals, probably, searching for some thread to hold together what the world kept trying to tear apart. Luther closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come quick. The sound of wind through pine, a distant owl, and underneath it all the steady living pulse of a land that refused to die. At dawn, the rooster cried hoarse and defiant. Luther was already up, rolling his shoulders, heading to the broken line of fence stretching toward the south field. Benji appeared minutes later, barefoot and grinning. You stayed. I did. Mama said you wouldn't. She's not wrong to doubt me. Benji handed him a pail. Cows need milking. You know how course I do. Papa taught me. They crossed the pasture together. The grass was wet with dew. Copper ran ahead, ears flopping. Luther glanced toward the house. Behind the glass, Maggie watched them go, coffee cup in hand, eyes unreadable. She didn't wave, but she didn't turn away either. Papa said the water turned against us, and when water turns, it kills quiet. Benji spoke the words so simply, so matter-of-fact, that for a moment, Luther Rainhorse forgot to breathe. They sat beneath the cottonwood by the barn, morning sun pouring across the land like honey, soft and slow. Copper lay stretched at their feet, tongue lolling. The pail of milk Benji had filled rested by the fence post, still warm from the cow's side. Luther set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his brow. He looked at the boy beside him, barefoot, sunburnt across the nose, but sharp-eyed and too quiet for someone his age. Your father said that. Benji nodded, right before he got too sick to stand. He made me promise not to drink from the well anymore. Said something in the water had gone wrong. Mama didn't believe him, not at first, and later she believed him too late. Luther's throat tightened. He looked out over the pasture where two lean cows grazed, ribs showing through their hides. The land was tired like everything else around here, overworked, underloved, and too proud to beg. How long was he sick? Benji picked a piece of grass and began folding it. Months. Started with tremors in his hands, then his stomach. Some days he couldn't hold a spoon. He'd just sit by the fire and shake. What did the doctor say? Said it was a fever. Told Mama it was from working too hard. But Mama, she saw it. In the water. In the way it tasted. In the way the fish died downstream after the mine opened. Luther turned his gaze north toward the ridge that split the valley. The Darrington Mining Company had carved it open like a wound. From the slope, iron-rich runoff bled down into the creek that fed every ranch in this corner of the Tongue River Basin. He'd seen this before, mines that gave jobs and took lives in return. Your mama tried to stop them, Benji scoffed. She tried everything. Rode into town, told the council, spoke to the preacher, spoke to Judge Matheson. Luther's head turned. Matheson, he laughed at her, called her dramatic, said no woman without a man should be talking in council meetings. Luther exhaled slow. Matheson had been a lawyer back when Luther was a deputy marshal. Even then he'd worn the law like a suit that didn't quite fit. Used it when it served him, tossed it when it didn't. Benji's voice dropped. Papa wrote things down. About the water, about the mine. Said he was making a record. Mama still reads them at night when she thinks I'm asleep. Where are they? In a box by the hearth. She won't let me touch them. Luther nodded. She's protecting them. She's protecting him, Benji corrected. She thinks if she holds on long enough, someone will listen. Luther didn't respond. He looked at his hands, calloused and cracked from fence work, and thought about the badge he hadn't worn in 3 years. Thought about his brother Tommy and the 30 seconds too late that haunted every mile since. Benji was staring at him now, studying him the way boys do when they've already lost one man and don't want to lose another. You ever seen someone die slow like that? The boy asked. Luther's jaw flexed. Yeah. Did anyone listen to you after? No. Benji nodded like he expected that. They don't listen to us either. Mama says it's 'cause we're not rich, or loud, or mean enough. Your mama's a smart woman, the smartest. She saw it before anyone, even when Papa tried to hide it. What did she do when he died? Benji's mouth pressed into a line. Buried him under the oak tree out back. With no one watching. Luther let the silence sit. After a moment, Benji added, "They wouldn't come, the townsfolk. Not even the preacher. Said it was best not to get involved." Luther felt something hard settle in his chest. He didn't ask what kind of man it took to ignore a funeral. He already knew. "She said something that day I'll never forget," Benji said, quieter now. She put her hand on the dirt and said, "They took your voice, Daniel, but they don't get mine." The words rang like a bell in Luther's mind. He stood suddenly. "Where's your mama now in the house?" "Reading. She always reads after chores." Luther dusted his hands. "Go help her bring in the laundry. I'll finish this stretch." Benji blinked. "You gonna look at the journals?" "No. I'm gonna ask permission." Benji smiled. "She'll say no. Maybe." Luther watched him trot off, Copper following close. He leaned against the fence and let the wind hit his face. The ridge loomed in the distance, red and broken like it had been split with an axe. That evening after supper, Luther stood near the hearth, hat in hand. Maggie sat on the floor by the fire, a thick ledger open in her lap. Her face was tight with fatigue, but her hands moved gently across the page. "I heard about the notes Daniel left," Luther said softly. She didn't look up. "I'd like to see them, if you'd let me." She didn't speak right away, just turned another page, slow and deliberate. Then finally, "Why? Because I know what poisoned water does, and I've seen what men like Matheson do to silence it." She looked up then. Her eyes weren't angry, just empty. The kind of empty that only comes from long, hard silence. "They already silenced him," she said. "You think scribbles in a book are going to change that?" "I don't know," Luther admitted. "But silence sure as hell won't." Her fingers tightened on the journal. "Maggie, let me help you finish what he started." She stared at the fire, then closed the book slowly and handed it to him. "Don't take it out of this house," she said, "and don't let my son see what's in there. He still sleeps through the night. I aim to keep it that way." Luther nodded. "You have my word." He sat cross-legged on the rug and opened the ledger. Daniel's handwriting was neat, almost compulsive. Page after page of water tests, creek depth, livestock illness, even notes on nearby families whose children had fallen sick. It wasn't just grief, it was evidence. Luther read for hours, only stopping when the lamp burned low. As he flipped through a worn page near the middle, one entry caught his eye. April 12th, sealed 3 water samples, labeled and hidden. "If anything happens to me, they'll prove it. The creek doesn't lie." His fingers stilled on the page. 3 water samples. He looked up. The room was quiet. Maggie had fallen asleep in her chair, arms crossed over her chest, face soft in the firelight. Luther closed the journal, placed it gently back on the shelf, and stepped outside into the dark. Overhead, the stars were sharp. Cold wind blew through the trees. Somewhere upstream, the river kept running. And maybe, just maybe, it still carried the truth. "Ain't no law up there, Luther. Just money and the men who break bones to keep it flowing." Morning bled slowly into the valley as the sky turned from ash to pale blue. The world was quiet, except for the distant yawn of cattle and the creak of wood stretching in the cool air. Luther Rainhorse stood by the porch steps, rolling up his sleeves, while Maggie handed him a steaming cup of coffee. "Where are you headed this early?" she asked, eyeing the rifle slung over his back. "Upstream." Her fingers tightened around the tin mug. "The ridge," he nodded. Daniel's notes mentioned a sealed box of water samples hidden near a runoff bend above the quarry line. Said it'd prove what killed him. "That land's owned by Darrington Mining now. Land's been here longer than deeds. You'll be trespassing. I've trespassed before." She didn't smile. They watched the ridge, and not just with eyes. Luther glanced at the edge of the pasture where Benji was feeding scraps to Copper, both of them laughing at something small and dumb. He watched the way the boy tilted his head just like his mother when curious. Just like his father probably had when he was still walking. "I won't take the trail," Luther said. "I know a way through the switchgrass." Maggie reached out suddenly and took his wrist, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let them bury you too." He met her eyes, saw the fear under the steel. "They'll have to try real hard." She let go and stepped back. "Be home before dark." He left the coffee cooling on the rail and walked into the trees. The climb wasn't easy. The path Daniel had marked in his journal had long grown over with scrub and roots. Luther's boots slipped more than once on shale, but he moved like a man used to rough land, used to danger. A hawk circled above him as he reached the ridgeline, its cry slicing through the wind like a warning. By midday, the sun scorched his shoulders through the thin fabric of his shirt. He stopped in the shade of a cluster of pine, drank from his canteen, and pulled out the sketch from Daniel's journal. A crude map, but clear enough, a split boulder near a dead pine creek, curving right samples buried at the base. He found the spot an hour later. The boulder was there, fractured clean down the middle. The pine, blackened by some old lightning strike, leaned like it had been waiting for someone to remember it. Luther dropped to his knees and began to dig. The earth was dry near the surface, but damp and dark beneath. He cleared away layers of moss and stone until his fingers struck wood. Small, narrow box sealed tight with wax-dipped twine. He wiped the dirt away and cracked it open. Inside, 3 glass vials nestled in cloth. Each was labeled in Daniel's handwriting dates and locations. The water inside was murky with hints of orange and green swirling like smoke. He exhaled slowly, heart ticking hard in his chest. Suddenly, branches cracked behind him. He froze, hand drifting toward the rifle beside him. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. More branches, slow steps. Luther rolled and grabbed the rifle, rising to a crouch. A man stood 10 yards away, half hidden behind scrub oak. Stocky neck like a post hat pulled low. "You lost?" the man asked, his voice too casual. "Just passing through," Luther said. "Funny place to pass through." Luther didn't answer. The man took 1 step forward. "This here's Darrington land. Didn't see a sign. Don't need one. Everybody knows. I ain't everybody." The man's eyes narrowed. "You with the Mallister woman?" Luther didn't move. "What's it to you? Company don't like trespassers, especially ones poking around water." Luther cocked his head. That a threat, that a question. They stared at each other, still as stones. Then the man spat, turned, and walked off into the trees. Luther didn't relax until the forest swallowed him whole. He wrapped the samples in cloth again, stashed them in his pack, and took a different way down the ridge, avoiding open ground. His mind ticked through everything, the samples, the man, the way he'd known Maggie's name. They were being watched. By the time he reached the barn, dusk was already pulling the sky into purples and golds. Maggie stood at the gate, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "I saw him," she said before he could speak. "Who, Ray Bricker? He came down from the ridge before you. Rode into town. Didn't stop to look back." Luther's hands curled into fists. "Company muscle," she said. "Been around since they expanded the west shaft. He knew your name." Of course he did. Luther pulled the samples from his bag and set them gently in her hands. She stared at them, eyes wide. "You found them. They're real. And they're damning." She touched the glass like it might break beneath her fingers. "We have proof now." Luther nodded. "I need to show this to someone who'll listen." He hesitated. "That list's real short." She looked up. There's a man in town, Elias Merton, used to be a geologist before the mine bought out the science. You trust him, he tried to warn the council before Daniel got sick. They laughed him out of the meeting. Sounds familiar. He's still angry, she said. But not afraid. Luther nodded. Then we go tomorrow. You sure once they know you found this? They already know. Maggie turned toward the house. I'll hide these tonight. He followed her to the porch, the world stretching long and quiet behind them. As they stepped inside, Benji looked up from the table where he was drawing a crooked fence line in charcoal. Did you find the poison? He asked. Luther stared at the boy. No, he said. I found the truth, and it was heavier than he'd expected. I carried that water in my hands, Luther. I watched it kill my cattle, then my kin. And still they told me it was just the heat. The church bells rang once, then twice. A false peace settled over the town of Red Hollow as dust lifted in lazy swirls along Main Street. Luther Rainhorse pulled his collar up against the wind and glanced at Maggie beside him. She walked with measured steps, clutching the small leather satchel close to her chest, the one holding the vials. People stared, the same way they always stared at a widow who refused to stay quiet. They passed the general store, the old telegraph office, and finally turned onto a side street that led toward the edge of town. The house they stopped at was modest, worn, and tucked behind a row of thirsty elms. The porch sagged slightly, and a rusted weather vane squeaked above the roof. Maggie knocked twice. Footsteps shuffled, then the door opened a crack. A wiry man with sharp features and silver stubble blinked at them from behind round spectacles. Maggie, he said. Wasn't sure I'd see you again. Elias, she replied. We need your help. His eyes flicked to Luther. This him, Elias asked. He's with me. Elias pushed the door wide. Then get in. Both of you. And quick. They stepped into a cramped room filled with books, papers, and the scent of old tobacco. A desk sat in the corner under the weight of maps, geology samples, and worn ledgers. Elias motioned for them to sit. I kept the records, he said, even after they tried to take them. Luther nodded toward a shelf. Mining maps, Elias smirked. The ones they thought I burned. I lied. Maggie opened the satchel and placed the 3 vials on the desk. The room shifted with their presence. Elias leaned in his hands, hovering above them like a priest before a relic. Good God, he muttered. These match what Daniel described. I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't, Maggie said softly. Elias picked up one vial, turned it in the light. See that shimmer? That's pyrite runoff. But there's more arsenic, most likely. You can smell it even sealed. Is it enough to prove harm? Luther asked. Elias set the vial down carefully. It's enough to prove intent. If these were taken from above the filtration line, it means the company never installed proper drainage. That's felony-level negligence. They'll deny it, Maggie said. Like always. Elias nodded. Unless someone with a badge brings it forward. Luther didn't answer. Elias turned to him. You were law once. I was, Luther said. You gave it up. It gave me up, he said. Voice dry. Elias pushed his glasses higher on his nose. Well, it might be time to take it back. Because if we don't act fast, this whole thing disappears. Evidence witnesses all of it. Maggie's voice was calm but forceful. We need someone to testify. Someone they'll believe. Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. Most of the ranchers have already been bought or scared quiet. But there's one, who Luther asked. Sadie Teller. She lost a whole herd last spring, 40 head. Buried 'em behind the ridge. But when she tried to speak out, 2 men showed up at her gate. Said her grazing lease might vanish. She's still in Red Hollow. Maggie asked. Out east near the cotton flats. Lives with her sister now. But she kept a few of the carcasses. Buried shallow for proof. Said she wasn't letting them win without a fight. Luther stood. Then we talked to Sadie. Elias's hand shot out. Careful. They watch her. And if they see you go in, it won't be long before someone else follows. Luther adjusted his coat. They're already following us. Outside, the town had grown quieter. 2 men in Darrington coats leaned on the corner post pretending to chew sunflower seeds. One made a show of spitting near Luther's boot. Luther didn't flinch. Maggie looked up at him. Sadie trusts no one, good Luther said. That means they haven't broken her. Elias gave them a slip of paper with directions drawn by hand, then pushed a weathered revolver across the table. I still keep it loaded, he said. But I'm too old to shoot straight anymore. Luther didn't touch the gun. I've got one. Then take it anyway. Company men don't play fair. They left as dusk colored the sky. Luther noticed one of the Darrington men fall in step behind them, too far to stop, but too close to ignore. By the time they reached the horses, Maggie turned sharp as a hawk. You want something? She asked the man. He smiled. Just making sure you folks get home safe. Luther stared him down. That's mighty kind. The man tipped his hat. We're good neighbors. They rode hard once out of sight, crossing through the cotton flats under cover of night. The moon guided them past dry gulches and fence posts leaning like old drunks. It was near midnight when they saw the lantern swinging on a front porch, the only light for miles. Sadie Teller stepped out, rifle in hand. Don't come no closer, she barked. It's Maggie Mallister, Maggie called out. I brought someone who knew Daniel. The rifle didn't lower. And we need your help. Sadie hesitated. Then slowly she motioned them forward. They approached carefully, horses snorting as they sensed the tension. I remember you, Sadie said, voice like gravel. You spoke at the feed co-op last year. You were the only one who clapped, Maggie said. Sadie smiled faintly. Ain't many folks clap for ghosts. She led them inside. The place smelled like cedar and old flour. A woman stirred in the next room but didn't emerge. Sadie poured whiskey without asking. Why now, she said. Why come to me? Luther set the satchel on the table and opened it. The glass vials caught the lantern light, glowing like cursed treasure. Sadie's face went still. I buried 3 calves with water like that in their bellies, she said. I carried that water in my hands, Luther. I watched it kill my cattle, then my kin. And still they told me it was just the heat. We can prove they lied, Maggie said. We just need someone else willing to say it out loud. Sadie looked at her. Then at Luther. I'll speak, she said at last. But only once. And only if someone swears to stand beside me when I do. Luther extended his hand. I give you my word. Sadie shook it. You'd better mean that, she said, eyes sharp. Because when this starts, there's no going back. Don't matter how many fences you build if the rot's already in the soil. The morning sky was a dull sheet of pewter, thick with a stillness that clung to the ground like mist. Luther stood near the edge of Sadie Teller's cotton field boot heel, resting on a broken fence post, eyes scanning the horizon. Maggie crouched beside a half-dug trench, brushing away the red earth with a flat spade. A sour stench lingered in the air, death deep and stubborn. Sadie knelt across from Maggie, sleeves rolled, mouth pressed tight. The shallow grave revealed 3 skeletal calves' ribs, sharp as thorns. Maggie leaned back on her heels, breathing through her scarf. You kept them here all this time, she asked. Sadie nodded. My sister told me to burn 'em, said it'd make the grief easier, but I couldn't. You did right. Luther said, stepping closer. This is more proof than the company ever thought you had. Sadie looked up at him. Proof won't mean much if they come knocking before it gets used. Maggie glanced back toward the house. We'll leave by noon. Take everything we've got to Elias. He said he'd prep the documents and find someone in the state office to look at it. Sadie shook her head. Don't bring the state. They move slow and breathe politics. You want change? You need the people first. Luther crouched beside the fence post, pulled a fragment of bone from the loose earth, then held it in the light. The edges were brittle, faintly discolored green and yellow, just like the tainted vials Elias had tested. They poisoned the ground, he muttered. Not just the water. Sadie nodded. I tested the soil last winter. Nothing grows on this stretch now, not even weeds. Maggie stood brushing her palms against her skirt. They'll keep expanding. Darrington's plans stretch east 3 more miles. This whole valley will turn toxic. They ain't planning, Sadie said coldly. They're already drilling. North Ridge. Started 3 days ago. Luther's brow tightened. Where the old wells are. Exactly. That's close to town. Too close. Maggie looked at him. If they hit that aquifer, it won't just be cattle dying. Luther straightened. Then we need to go. Today. Sadie covered the grave with a tarp, weighing the corners with rocks. I'll come with you. I want to see Elias put this all on paper. I want to see the lies burned to ash. They gathered their evidence samples sealed in wax sketches of the dead land, Elias's maps, and Sadie's written account. By the time they saddled the horses, the wind had picked up, pushing the scent of earth and fire across the plains. As they rode toward town, Luther's thoughts turned like storm clouds. Every step forward tightened the grip of the noose. He knew men like Darrington didn't care about land or people, just control. And control came easy when no one fought back. 2 miles from Red Hollow, they saw the smoke. It rose in a lazy black column from the west end of town, thin, almost graceful. But it wasn't chimney smoke. This burned hot, angry. Luther spurred his horse faster. Maggie followed Sadie tight behind. When they reached the outskirts, the general store was still smoldering. Flames had already chewed through the front wall, glass shattered across the walk. The sheriff's office next door stood untouched, the deputy leaning on the rail with a toothpick in his mouth like nothing had happened. Elias wasn't there. Maggie leapt from her horse. Where's Elias? The deputy shrugged. Ain't seen him. Sadie stormed up the steps. Store don't burn itself down. The deputy looked her over slowly, eyes heavy with condescension. Maybe someone left a lantern on. Luther stepped forward close enough to smell the man's sweat. How long you planning to pretend you don't work for Darrington? The deputy smirked. I work for the county. You mean the one Darrington bought last spring? The smirk faded. You're making trouble. Luther didn't blink. Only for the right people. He turned to Maggie. We find Elias, now. They moved fast, ducking through alleyways and back streets. The town had gone quiet again, like it always did after something mean passed through. Elias's house was dark. The door had been kicked in. Maggie ran ahead, calling his name. No answer. Inside, papers had been torn down, vials smashed on the floor. Luther crouched near the desk. Its drawers were gutted, even the floorboards pried up. Gone, he said. Sadie's voice came from the hallway. Back windows broken. Maggie's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything left untouched. Then she spotted it wedged behind a loose board beneath the desk. She reached down and pried out a sealed envelope thick with folded documents. His backup, she whispered. Luther took the packet, glanced through the pages. Diagrams, soil results, Daniel's journal transcripts, even photos. Elias had been ready for this. He knew, Luther muttered. He knew they'd come. Sadie leaned against the wall, her face pale. So where is he now? Luther slipped the envelope into his coat. Gone underground, probably. Maybe hiding at the old mission camp. That place is condemned, Maggie said. That's why they won't look there. We need him, she said. We can't testify alone. Sadie crossed her arms. We testify, they bury us. We testify with Elias, we might have a chance. Luther nodded. We wait till dark. Then we go find him. Maggie stepped outside, eyes sweeping the horizon. In the distance beyond the ridge, drilling towers loomed like broken teeth silhouetted against the sinking sun. She didn't speak for a long time. When she finally turned back, her voice was steady. Every hour we wait, more of this land dies. Luther stepped beside her, fingers resting on the revolver at his hip. Then we make this hour count. The things they bury don't stay buried. Not here. Not in Red Hollow. The wind hissed through the cracked, stained glass windows of the old mission chapel, rattling dry leaves across the floor. Luther pushed open the warped wooden door and stepped inside, hand instinctively brushing the butt of his revolver. Shadows clung to the edges of the room like secrets, broken pews, leaning at odd angles, as if the place had finally given in to sorrow. Maggie and Sadie followed Boots, quiet on the dust-covered tile. A single candle flickered near the altar, its flame guttering. He was here. Luther motioned silently, and the women fanned out. Behind the altar, beside a splintered confessional, a figure emerged, gaunt with a swollen eye and a bandaged arm. Elias. Close the door, he rasped. Maggie hurried to shut it behind them, sliding the iron bolt across. Elias limped forward. They came the night after you left. Ransacked the place, burned the store. I barely made it out. You saved the documents, Luther said. Elias tapped his coat pocket. Had 'em copied. Originals were decoys. I knew they'd come looking. Sadie stepped beside him, gently guiding him to a bench. They're escalating. Fast. They're scared, Elias said. Means we're close. Luther paced slowly down the aisle. We've got Sadie's testimony, the soil samples, the maps. We need to put it all in front of someone who can't be bought. Elias nodded. There's a federal marshal, Paul Brannigan. Used to be out of Amarillo, now works regional. Clean. And he hates corporate corruption with a holy fire. Can we reach him? Maggie asked. Elias exhaled. He'll be in Denton for the state circuit trial in 2 days. If we ride tonight, we make it by tomorrow's sundown. That's a long ride, Sadie muttered. And Darrington's not about to let us get there. Elias held up a torn piece of map. There's an old courier trail that cuts through the Badlands. Abandoned since the floods, but passable. No eyes there. Luther studied the route. We'll take it. We leave in an hour. Sadie glanced around the ruined chapel. What about here? They won't come back, Elias said. They think I'm dead. Luther looked at him, frowning. That may be the only thing keeping you alive? Outside, the world had turned gold with the last of the sun. Maggie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the hills. I saw something earlier, she said. Dust trail, too slow for cattle. Luther stepped beside her. Scouts, probably 3 miles off. Then we don't wait. They packed quick rations, water, the sealed testimony, and the vial samples tucked in oilcloth. Elias stayed behind his frame, too weak for the trail. He gave Luther a worn badge, an old deputy's tin star dulled with time. Just in case, Elias said. Luther didn't want it, but he took it. By moonrise, they rode out, crossing the bone-dry creek bed and heading southeast through the bluffs. The land was rough, scarred with canyons and broken fence lines. The courier trail, barely visible, wove through the scrub like a snake path. Hours passed with little sound but hoofbeats and breath. Maggie broke the silence. What happens if we make it? If Brannigan listens, then Darrington answers for every grave, Luther said. And if he doesn't, Sadie spat into the dust. Then we raise hell ourselves. They didn't stop till the moon was high. Luther called for a rest at a narrow pass between two ridges. He dismounted, kneeling to scan the distant hills. Then he saw it torchlight. Faint. Distant. But moving. They followed, he said. Maggie turned, squinting. How close, far enough. But not for long. Sadie cursed under her breath. We go now, no, Luther said. We give them something to follow. He grabbed a length of burlap and tore it from his bedroll, then stuffed it with brush and saddlecloth. Maggie helped douse it with leftover bacon grease. They lit it and sent the decoy mule east toward the dry gulch. Its hooves kicked up dust, the flames trailing behind like a phantom. Buy us maybe an hour, Luther said, mounting up. They rode harder now, the terrain growing cruel, rocks, sharper, wind stronger. At one point, Maggie's horse stumbled, its leg gashing on a jagged stone. She cried out, nearly thrown, but clung to the reins. Luther pulled beside her, steadying her. I'm fine, she said through gritted teeth. But she wasn't. Her knee had twisted bad. Luther could see it in the way she held herself, teeth clenched, sweat on her brow. We need to stop, he said. Sadie shook her head. Can't. Not yet. They made it to the next rise before they dismounted again. The stars above were white fire against the black sky. Far below, the torchlight still hunted, now scattered, divided between trails. Luther crouched beside Maggie. You ride with me now? I can still, you don't need to prove anything, he said quietly. You've done enough. She didn't argue. He lifted her gently, cradling her leg against his side as she climbed onto his horse. She leaned into him, breath short, pain buried deep. They pressed on. By dawn, the trail narrowed into a sandstone ravine. The wind howled low, whistling through the jagged mouths of the rocks. Luther slowed. He felt it before he heard it. A soft snap of brush, a faint metallic clink. Then, don't move. A voice, male, crisp. From the rocks above, 4 riders emerged, Darrington's men rifles drawn. The lead one, heavy-set, clean coat, gray hat, grinned. Well, if it ain't the preacher and his flock. Sadie raised her hands slowly. We're just passing. Yeah, I figured, he said. Passing judgment, too. His rifle pointed straight at Luther. Hand over the satchel. Luther didn't flinch. You shoot me, you lose the one thing your bosses care about, silence. That's over if I fall. The man laughed. Oh, I don't need to shoot you, Mr. Rainhorse. Just slow you down enough to make sure you don't reach Denton. He flicked his chin. Another man stepped forward, taking aim at the horses. Don't! Maggie shouted. Too late. A shot rang out. One of the horses reared, screamed, then collapsed, blood blooming across its flank. Luther dove, pulling Maggie down, as bullets tore into the stone around them. Sadie rolled behind a rock, drawing her pistol and firing back. Luther drew fast, 2 clean shots, 1 man dropped. The others scattered, shouting. Maggie crawled, dragging the satchel under her chest. Luther, she cried. The papers, another shot, this one grazing his shoulder. He roared, firing again, this time dead center. The last rider fled his horse, kicking up rocks as he vanished down the canyon. Silence fell sharp and sudden. Luther stood slowly, clutching his bleeding arm. You all right? He asked Maggie. She nodded, trembling. Sadie limped forward. We're not dead. Not yet, Luther said, but they'll send more. He lifted the satchel, dirt-streaked, but whole. "The things they bury don't stay buried," he said grimly. "Not here. Not in Red Hollow." They mounted what horses remained and rode on toward Denton with the weight of truth growing heavier with every mile. Of course, here's Chapter 8 written according to your instructions. Some men carry a gun. Others carry the truth. Only one of them needs reloading. The town of Denton shimmered beneath the weight of late summer heat, a veil of dust swirling around its edges as the riders came down off the canyon ridge. Luther's horse limped slightly, saddle darkened with blood from the morning's skirmish. Maggie clung to him pale and quiet, her injured leg bound with Sadie's torn shawl. The three of them moved like shadows, worn watchful and grim. They didn't go through the main street. Instead, Luther led them through the alleyways between crates of dry goods and rusting troughs behind shuttered saloons. It was still early enough that most of Denton hadn't stirred. But eyes watched from windows, and whispers slid through cracks like wind. Marshal Paul Brannigan's office stood beside the old livery barn. Its paint sun-peeled the badge carved into the wood, worn smooth by time and weather. Luther dismounted, boots crunching against gravel. Sadie helped Maggie down as he stepped forward and knocked. A moment later, the door swung open. A tall man with a shock of silver hair, broad shoulders, and a face carved by disappointment stood there. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, landed on Luther first, then drifted to the women behind. Rainhorse Brannigan said, voice low and steady. "Never thought I'd see you crawl out from whatever hole you buried yourself in." "I didn't come to reminisce," Luther replied. "I brought proof." Brannigan studied him a moment longer, then stepped aside. Inside, the air was cool. A pot of coffee steamed on the corner stove. Files were stacked in organized disorder across the desk. Sadie laid the satchel down gently. "We need federal protection," she said without preamble. "Darrington Mining's been poisoning Red Hollow's land and silencing witnesses. The judge there has bought the sheriff worse." Brannigan glanced at her. "You Sadie Lark. I used to work in their record room until they found out I wasn't blind." He pulled up a chair and motioned to the stack. "Let's see it." Luther opened the satchel. Soil reports, water samples, Ruth Mallory's statement written in firm cursive, signed confessions from Doc Ezra, who'd finally told the truth before disappearing, and photos, Elias's hidden work capturing the dead cattle, the black stream, the warped bones near the mine's edge. Brannigan's brow furrowed deeper as he flipped through the pages. "I'll need to verify these labs." "They're real," Sadie said. "I don't doubt it," Brannigan murmured. "But belief ain't admissible." Then he came to the map. The mineral rights, the overlay showing Darrington's illegal expansion into sacred tribal land, protected under federal covenant, but kept quiet by forged surveys and bought-off clerks. Brannigan's jaw set. "I've been waiting 20 years for something this clear," he said. "But bringing this to court puts a mark on all of you." Luther leaned forward. "They already tried to kill us twice. They'll try again. Let them." Brannigan looked at him with something close to respect. "I'll file the motion, but I'll need you to testify. All of us will," Sadie said, glancing at Maggie. The girl nodded, her voice hoarse. "My daddy died for telling the truth. I won't run from it." Brannigan stood pulling on his coat. "It'll take a day to get the hearing. Judge Alcott's presiding, old school but fair. You'll stay here. Guards posted outside." "Appreciated," Luther said. The marshal paused before leaving. "They'll come tonight. You know that." Luther nodded. "Then we'll be ready." By dusk, the house beside the courthouse had been turned into a makeshift bunker. Maggie rested on a cot in the parlor, leg elevated. Sadie cleaned her revolver in silence. Luther sat at the window, eyes scanning every shadow that moved across the dirt street. Footsteps approached. A knock. Then a familiar voice. "Luther, it's Elias." He opened the door cautiously. Elias stood there, blood dried on his sleeve, one eye swollen shut but alive. Behind him was a young man with dark braids, firm stance, and steady eyes. "This is Wyatt Stone," Elias said, "from the White Mesa Nation." His father was one of the original land stewards Darrington stole from. Wyatt stepped forward, holding out a small bundle wrapped in doeskin. "These are the tribal land claims," he said. "Original documents, passed through my grandfather's hands. If your judge is honest, they'll stand." Luther took them with quiet reverence. "You came far." "Justice is always a long ride," Wyatt replied. Inside, they spread the documents out under the lantern light. Sadie leaned close, scanning signatures. Her fingers trembled slightly. "They never counted on this," she said. "On the past fighting back." Elias spoke low. "Men like Darrington build empires on silence, but silence don't last forever." The night deepened. Brannigan returned just past 10, face grim. "They know you're here." "Word's out." "How many?" Luther asked. "Too many for one front. But I've got 2 deputies coming in from Stillwater. They'll hold the east." "And the west?" Sadie asked. "That's us." They set their positions. Wyatt took the back entrance. Sadie and Elias guarded the stairwell. Luther moved to the porch with Brannigan, both men watching the darkness fold over the street. For a long time there was only the sound of insects and wind. Then came the low thunder of hooves. 4 riders, then 6, all dressed in dusters, their rifles held low. Behind them a covered wagon, ominous, sealed. Brannigan called out, "This is federal ground. You are trespassing." One man rode forward, slim, cruel, with a long scar down his jaw. "We ain't here for words," he shouted. "Hand over the girl and the papers, and nobody bleeds." Luther stepped forward. "You want them? Come get them." The man smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." He raised his hand. Gunfire exploded. The first shot ripped through the porch beam. Brannigan dropped to one knee, firing back. The deputy behind the window hit a rider clean off his horse. Inside, Sadie returned fire from the second-floor stair, dropping another. Elias threw open the back door and let loose with a shotgun, forcing 2 to retreat. Luther fired twice, clean and steady. One shot struck the wagon's wheel. It collapsed in a roar, sending the contents explosives crashing into the dirt. The blast rocked the street. Fire bloomed. Screams echoed. Wyatt charged out, bow in hand, loosing an arrow straight into a fleeing man's chest. In the chaos, the scar-faced leader tried to run, but Maggie, hobbling on one leg, picked up Brannigan's dropped revolver and fired. The shot was clumsy but true. He fell face first into the dust. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fire and the shallow breaths of the wounded. Brannigan stood slowly. "That the worst of it, for now," Luther said, exhaling. Wyatt looked toward the courthouse. "Tomorrow we fight with papers. Tonight we fought with blood." Luther looked at the satchel still intact beside the door. "Some men carry a gun," he said, voice steady. "Others carry the truth. Only one of them needs reloading." Inside, Maggie sat back, eyes closed, and the town of Denton braced for morning. "Certainly. Here is Chapter 9 written in line with the outline, emotional tone, and narrative flow you've established. A town that forgets its dead will soon be buried with them." The early morning in Denton carried a strange silence, thick as cotton. Smoke from the night's attack still hung in the air, curling like ghosts above the broken porch rail. The courthouse steps were damp with dew, and ash blood long soaked into the cracks. A broom scraped against the boards as Wyatt Stone methodically swept bullet casings into a tin pail, his movements slow, deliberate. Not far from him, Maggie sat beside the boarded window, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sky burn blue behind the rising sun. Inside the marshal's office, the atmosphere was different, pressured tight like a drum about to split. Brannigan had summoned the federal judge to Denton. The hearing was set for midday, but it already felt like a trial had begun in the court of public tension. Onlookers, once silent neighbors, now leaned against posts and porches. Word had spread. Some came curious, some came scared, and some came to see if Darrington would finally fall. Sadie paced the length of the holding room, papers clutched in her hand. The confession, the land titles, the death certificates. She had read them so many times the ink might as well have been burned into her skin. "They're going to try something," she said. "It won't be a fair fight." "It's not supposed to be fair," Luther replied from the doorway. "It's supposed to be public." Sadie stopped pacing. "You think that makes a difference to men like Rourke?" Luther looked down at his hands. "I think it makes a difference to the ones who've been scared into silence." Outside, a freight wagon rolled in from Stillwater carrying 2 federal officers and a judge who looked like he'd rather be in a coffin than a courtroom. Judge Walter Alcott was tall and severe, his black coat stitched with meticulous care. His eyes, cold and sunken, scanned the street like a vulture searching for weak prey. Brannigan greeted him with a nod. "Appreciate you coming on short notice." "You made a hell of a case," Alcott said, stepping down. "Let's see if your town's ready for the weight of truth." The courtroom was packed by noon. Wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of generations, ranchers, traders, mothers, old miners, and boys who'd grown up watching Darrington trucks kick dust down their roads. Some had lost family, some had lost land, most had lost their voice. Luther took a seat beside Maggie and Sadie. Wyatt stood behind them, arms folded. Brannigan sat near the judge, prepared to testify. On the opposite side, Darrington's lawyer, Chester Velman, looked oiled and polished. He carried no papers, just a smirk and a promise of intimidation. The judge rapped the gavel. "We begin today's hearing with opening statements. The matter before us regards the poisoning of tribal and public lands, wrongful deaths, and potential collusion between Darrington Mining and certain public officials." Velman stood first. "Your Honor, these are fabrications, speculative documents from a group of vigilantes and disgruntled former employees. There is no admissible evidence, no chain of custody, and no scientific verification." Sadie stood before Alcott could even ask. "Your Honor, permission to speak as a first-hand witness." Alcott raised a brow. "Name and relation: Sadie Lark. Former clerical assistant at Darrington Mining. Dismissed for refusing to alter records related to toxic discharge. Proceed." She walked to the stand with the quiet strength of someone who'd already buried her fear. She produced the first sample soil from Red Hollow, turned black at the roots. Then the photographs, bodies of livestock, deformed fish sediment clouding the once clear river. She handed over Ezra's written statement, a confession of altered medical reports under threat of violence. And finally, she presented Ruth's journal, the last page written with a shaking hand before she vanished. "They poisoned the land and called it progress, but the earth remembers." A murmur swept the room. Velman stood. "Your Honor, none of these are certified by state laboratories." Brannigan stood. "Because those labs are owned by Darrington subsidiaries. I sent 3 of these to an independent lab in Helena. Here are the results." He placed sealed documents before the judge. Alcott opened them. His face remained still, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I'll allow it into evidence," he said. The courtroom quieted like a held breath. Then came Waya. He brought the land claim documents, some nearly a century old, signed by government officials and tribal elders alike. The maps showed Darrington's steady encroachment, inch by inch, into protected land. The treaties were never rescinded, Waya said, only ignored. Then Maggie stood. The girl leaned on a cane, her voice low and halting, but her words hit like thunder. She spoke of her father's last days, his lungs once strong from years of ranching, eaten away by invisible toxins. She spoke of Ruth gone without a trace. She pointed to the back of the courtroom where the sheriff once sat before fleeing in the night. They killed my parents without ever firing a bullet, she said, and no one stood up. But we are now. Alcott stared at her, then nodded. Final witness, he said. Mr. Rainhorse. Luther stepped forward. I didn't come to this town to be a hero, he began. I came because a boy grabbed my leg in a river and asked for help. A few in the audience looked down, a few wept. I've seen what power does when it goes unchecked. I've seen it burn villages and break families. But I've also seen what happens when ordinary people remember who they are. He turned to face the crowd. This isn't just about stolen land or poisoned water. It's about memory. A town that forgets its dead will soon be buried with them. The judge didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small hand-bound notebook. My father worked in a copper mine outside Butte, he said quietly. He died coughing up dust while the company denied it had anything to do with it. I never forgot. He stood. I'm ordering a federal injunction against Darrington Mining effective immediately. All operations are to cease. A criminal investigation will proceed regarding all associated parties. There was silence, then applause, and then a roar, but not from outside, from above. The courthouse windows shook, gunshots cracked through the air. Waya dove toward Maggie, covering her. Brannigan shouted orders. Alcott was pulled down behind the bench. A bullet shattered the glass just inches from Sadie's face. Luther grabbed her, pulling her to the floor. They're not done, he said, breath tight. Not yet, because the truth had just been spoken. And Darrington had always feared truth more than bullets. Bullets tore through the glass like lightning through brittle sky. Shouts rang out as townsfolk ducked for cover behind pews and benches, screams cut short by the slap of wood and ricochet of lead. Smoke from gunpowder spilled into the room like a vengeful fog. Maggie was screaming for Luther. Sadie lay still behind the judge's bench, hands pressed to her ears. Waya crouched low with his revolver drawn, fired 2 shots toward the shattered windows. Then silence, but it was the kind of silence that meant someone was waiting for a reload. The enemy isn't outside the building. It's already in the bones of this town. Luther's mind wasn't on fear. It was calculating distance, angles, timing. He crawled toward Brannigan, who was pinned behind the jury box, blood soaking through his sleeve. Brannigan looked up, pale but alert. You're hit, grazed Brannigan hissed. Upper arm, more bark than bite. The judge crouched beside them was shaking. This isn't a trial. It's a war zone. No, Judge, Luther said, steady as rock. This is what justice looks like when it's been buried for too long. Outside, the gunmen repositioned. Shadows moved on the rooftops. 2 men with repeater rifles stood behind overturned wagons, Rourke's men, paid in blood and promises. The courthouse had become a tomb unless someone broke the stalemate. Luther stood. Waya hissed. You'll catch a round between the eyes. Not if they see me carrying something bigger than a gun. He grabbed the old tribal war staff from the courthouse wall, ornamental, ceremonial, but tall and unmistakable. As he moved toward the doorway, the light hit the carved eagle feathers on its crown. Wya's voice cracked the tension. "You better know what you're doing, Rainhorse." Luther paused. "So do they." He stepped into the sun. A hush followed. Guns didn't fire. Rourke's men stood frozen as Luther walked down the courthouse steps, staff held high like a signal fire. "Is this what the Darrington name stands for?" he shouted across the square. Shooting into a courthouse during a trial, one of the gunmen lowered his rifle. Another didn't. Luther kept walking. Dust curled around his boots. Your fight isn't with a judge or a sick girl. It's with the truth you were too scared to look in the eye. The rifle cracked once. The round zipped past his shoulder, hitting the stone pillar behind him. Still, Luther didn't flinch. Then, from the alley, a sound rattling iron hooves and the distinct bark of an old hound. Copper. Ezra came out from behind the blacksmith shop, riding Brannigan's horse, waving a handkerchief high. Behind him were 10 ranchers, 4 women, and 2 old-timers with shotguns older than the town charter. Their faces were drawn, eyes set. This was no militia. This was a reckoning. The standoff cracked. Rourke's men, realizing they'd lost the crowd, scattered like rats under lantern light. One of them tried to reload and took a buckshot blast to the hip from Martha's old scattergun. Another bolted and got tackled by 2 teens wielding fence posts. Luther turned and looked toward the upper balcony of the saloon. Rourke stood there watching. No expression, just calculation. His gaze met Luther's and lingered long enough to promise that the fight wasn't over. Brannigan had been taken inside and stitched up by Ezra, who'd once practiced veterinary medicine in the war. The courthouse had been cleared and secured by the townsfolk, who now stood vigil in the square. Sadie sat beside Maggie, wrapping her arm around the girl's shoulders. "She's gone too quiet," Sadie whispered. "She's processing," Wya said. "But when she speaks again, it'll be with fire." In the marshal's office, Luther watched the room change. People came in with ledgers, old records, land claims, photos, testimonies. One woman brought a water-stained Bible belonging to her husband, who had worked in the mines and died last fall. She pointed to a highlighted verse. "Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and write grievousness which they have prescribed." She read aloud. The walls of that office, once bare, now grew heavy with truth. Proof of things denied lost or buried. That evening, a gathering took place in front of the old church. No preacher, no choir. Just townsfolk standing in a wide circle as torches burned low and stars blinked through the dusk. Wya stepped forward. "This town has lived under the weight of one name too long. We've been told who we are by those who would profit from our silence." He turned to Luther. "But it took a stranger, one haunted by his own failures, to remind us what justice smells like: smoke and dust and rain on hard dirt." Luther said nothing. He simply placed the staff into the earth at the center of the circle. A marker, not of war, of memory. Sadie stepped up next. "Tomorrow they'll try again, in a suit or with a bullet. But we've already won. We stopped being afraid." Copper barked once, a sharp sound that made Maggie smile for the first time since the shooting. Then, from the shadows beyond the firelight, a figure approached. Slim, cloaked in black. It was Elias Vance. He had been missing since the raid on Ruth's homestead. Maggie froze. Luther moved first hand on his revolver, but Vance raised both hands. "I didn't come for war." His voice was rough, cracked like a man who hadn't spoken in days. "I came because I found something." He pulled a small bundle from his coat. "Letters, Ruth's letters. To Maggie," he said. Maggie took them with trembling fingers, unfolded the topmost page. Her lips moved silently as she read. Sadie stepped beside her. "What is it?" "She knew they'd come for her," Maggie whispered. "She didn't run. She left these for me to find the rest." Sadie's eyes narrowed. "The rest," Maggie looked up. "Proof. She said it's hidden where the earth burns, but the water never boils." Wyatt muttered, "The sulfur springs." Luther's jaw set. "That's Darrington's first claim, abandoned since the explosion. And now the center of their lie," Maggie said. The crowd quieted. A single gust of wind passed through scattering ash and dust into the night. Luther looked out toward the black hills. "It's time we unearthed what they buried." The torches flickered. The townsfolk didn't move. But something in the air had changed. It wasn't just defiance anymore. It was resolve. Rain swept over the flatlands like a gray curtain, swallowing the silhouettes of the hills in the distance. Luther rode ahead, soaked to the bone, but steady eyes fixed on the craggy rise known as Black Hollow Ridge. The sulfur springs hissed in the distance, unseen, but pungent their stench, curling through the wind like a warning. Behind him, Maggie clung to her saddle, her mother's letters bound tight beneath her coat. Sadie rode beside her, pale but focused rifle slung across her back. Wyatt brought up the rear, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. They were not a posse. They were something older, something raw, born of truth fury and the slow grind of injustice. "The deeper we dig, the hotter the ground gets. But it's not hell we'll find under Darrington's land. It's the truth they buried alive." They reached the edge of the springs by dusk. Mist hovered above the steaming water, and the wind shrieked as it passed between jagged rocks. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and scorched earth. Maggie dismounted, her boots sinking slightly into the mud as she walked toward a crumbling stone outcrop. "She wrote about this," she murmured. "Said the map was false. They built the mine entrance beneath the hot springs. Called it the back mouth." Luther scanned the terrain. They wouldn't leave a tunnel open after the explosion. "She said they sealed it with iron," Maggie replied, pointing to a rust-covered slab halfway buried in dirt. "But not from the inside." Wyatt stepped forward and struck the slab with the butt of his rifle. The hollow clang that answered him confirmed it. Beneath the mud was a hidden door. It took all four of them a crowbar and nearly an hour of digging to expose the entrance. When the iron gave way, the door creaked open on hinges that screamed like ghosts. A hot wind whooshed from the depths filled with rot ash and time. They lit lanterns and descended. The shaft sloped downward into darkness. The walls were scorched black. Old rail ties jutted from the dirt like broken ribs. They passed collapsed beams, rusted tools, and shattered mining helmets, some still bearing names carved into the brims. Sadie touched one gently. "They died here, or were buried here," Luther said grimly. Maggie's lantern flickered across a carved beam. "There," she said. "That's my father's handwriting." The words were etched with a knife shaft, 3 leads to aquifer. Wyatt moved ahead. "That's where the water samples came from. That's what Darrington tried to hide." The tunnel narrowed and the air grew hotter. The wood underfoot turned damp, then slick. A low rumble echoed from beneath their boots. They reached a chamber filled with crates, deteriorated, but some still intact. Inside, vials, ledgers, letters bearing Darrington Mining's seal. Maggie opened one. "It's a letter from Everett Rourke to the State Safety Board," she whispered. "He lied, said the mine passed inspection 3 days before the collapse. But this one," she held up, "another shows they knew about the leak weeks earlier." Luther read over her shoulder. "And the sulfur contamination. These records prove the mine poisoned the water table. And they knew it." Sadie said bitterly. Suddenly, Waya raised his hand. Footsteps. They doused the lanterns. Silence. Then faint wood creaking. Rocks shifting. Voices murmuring. They followed us, Luther growled. We take the records and get out, Waya said. Fast. But Maggie shook her head. No, there's more. My mother said the last box was hidden beneath the altar. Luther stared at her. Altar, she pointed to the far wall. Embedded in stone was a crude wooden cross, half rotted but still upright. It was a prayer room. They used it during the strike when the men refused to leave the mine. Some of them died in here praying for their children for a day of reckoning. Beneath the cross, a slab of rock looked out of place, smoother, rounder. Luther knelt, felt the edge, and with Waya's help, pried it loose. Inside was a weathered tin box wrapped in oilskin. Maggie opened it. Inside were letters, affidavit signatures, and one small black book. This is my father's journal, she breathed. Every name, every number, every lie. Footsteps thundered behind them. Move, Waya shouted. They fled up the shaft, the sound of boots closing in behind. Luther turned once and fired a warning shot. The tunnel lit in brief flashes long enough to see two men duck back, masked and armed. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet. Their horses waited, trembling. They mounted fast. Maggie clutched the journal, her hands bleeding. Luther turned. Ride, don't look back. Gunfire cracked behind them, rounds hissing past like angry bees. Waya turned in his saddle, returned fire. One of Rourke's men cried out and fell. They pushed the horses hard across the rocky rise back toward the old road that led to town. At the ridge, they paused only when the lights of Willow Ridge flickered in the distance. Sadie leaned forward, clutching her ribs. I think I cracked something back there. We'll get Doc Price, Luther said. You just stay on the horse. Waya dismounted to check their back trail. They're not following. Must have lost the nerve. Maggie opened the journal, shielding it from the rain. My father names the judge. The sheriff, too. There's even a page on Shaw's dealings in Silver Falls. This is bigger than we thought. Luther looked toward the town where a single bell now rang from the church tower. They're calling a gathering, he said. They'll try to bury it again, Waya muttered. Luther nodded. Then we dig deeper. Maggie raised the journal, not just with shovels, with truth. Thunder rolled low across the sky as they rode rain, turning the trail to mud. But they didn't stop. In town, the people were waiting, some with torches, some with rifles, and standing at the head of them, holding Copper's leash, was Ezra, eyes hard. Did you find it? He asked. Maggie held up the journal. Ezra stepped aside. Then it's time we read it aloud. The church was packed wall to wall. Rain slicked the windows and thunder cracked in the distance, but no one moved. The people of Willow Ridge had come, wrinkled ranchers, young farm hands, mothers with children wrapped in shawls, even old Judge Malloy, who hadn't stepped foot past his porch since the floods 2 winters back. All of them silent. All of them staring at the altar where Maggie stood. She held the little black journal in both hands, its leather warped with time, its edges darkened by blood, mud, and grief. Behind her, Waya leaned against the door with his rifle at his side. Sadie sat near the front, pale but upright, ribs bound tight. Luther stood near the pulpit jaw, set ready for what would follow. The truth doesn't whisper, Maggie began, voice steady despite the tremble in her fingers. It groans beneath the ground until someone finally listens. She opened the book. The pages crackled like old firewood. Her father's handwriting stretched across the first page in dark strokes. If I die before justice is done, let this account testify in my place. Gasps echoed as she read aloud the details of the mine's corrosion, the bribery of local officials, the forged letters from Everett Rourke, the forged inspections, and the manipulated death records. She read the names of workers who died in the sealed shaft and the water contamination records buried under legal jargon. This page, she said, turning it to the crowd, shows Sheriff Langley took a monthly stipend from the Darrington Trust 3 years' worth. In exchange, he buried assault reports from the strike. Judge Malloy's eyes dropped, then Maggie's voice softened. My father wrote about the final day. When the mine buckled and 22 men begged for help, he went in. Not to mine, but to pray, to take samples, to leave this record in case he didn't make it back. He sealed it in the prayer alcove himself. A hush. Then, from the back, a voice called out, "You expect us to believe this. You think a dead man's words will stand up to Rourke's lawyers." It was Harlan Tate, landowner and bank backer of Rourke's projects. Luther turned. This isn't about belief anymore. It's about proof. Sadie stood slowly, and every lie they fed us, we drank. I've got scars on my lungs and water I can't even bathe my baby in. This ain't justice, it's war on the poor. Doc Price stepped forward, white coat soaked from his walk. I falsified Daniel's death certificate, he said, voice cracking. Under pressure. I thought if I didn't, I'd lose the clinic. But that man didn't die from a cave-in. He died from sulfur exposure. The room rippled with murmurs. Then Maggie lifted the final letter sealed and dated 1 week before her father's death. This is addressed to Governor Halbrook. Never sent. It details everything, including the bribery ring between Darrington Mining and Silver Falls' state officials. My father tried to expose it all, and now so will we. Ezra stepped forward, lantern in hand. We'll ride to Silver Falls, deliver it ourselves, not just ride, Luther added. We'll bring witnesses, evidence, testimony, this journal, these samples, and the people whose lives were shattered. And who'll protect us? Harlan sneered. You think Rourke will let that happen? From the rear, the church door creaked open. In stepped 4 men, ranchers, all armed. One nodded to Maggie. We will. Another stood. And we will. Then another. Within minutes, the church was on its feet. Faces once dulled by defeat now shone with resolve. Old men clutched rifles, young women gripped hands, and even children stood between parents with widened eyes watching the town rise. Maggie looked to Wyatt. He nodded. You stirred the fire. Now ride it. Thunder shook the steeple. Rain lashed the glass. But inside, the flame of purpose burned high. By dawn, the plan was made. A caravan of 12 would ride to Silver Falls at first light. Maggie would carry the journal and letters. Doc Price would provide sworn medical records. Luther and Wyatt would guard the trail. Sadie would remain in Willow Ridge to organize support and gather additional names. Ezra, despite protests, would ride up front, leading with the flag once used in the miners' union, frayed but proud. The ride began under low clouds. Wind tugged at their coats as hooves pounded the sodden trail. The mountains rose in the distance, veiled by mist and mystery. They passed the broken fence lines, where cattle no longer grazed the dried wells that coughed up sulfur, and the graves with unmarked stones. Every mile whispered the cost. At midday, they stopped to water the horses near Birch Creek. Maggie sat beside the fire journal, wrapped in waxed canvas, eyes locked on the flames. What if they laugh at us? She asked quietly. They won't, Luther replied. But what if they do? He looked at her eyes, soft. Then we stand anyway. She nodded, tears rising but held back. That night they camped near Widow's Bluff beneath a sky split by lightning. In the flickering dark, Maggie reread the final entry of the journal, her father's last words scrawled with a trembling hand. Truth is not a weapon. It's a mirror, and those who fear it have already lost. She closed the book. Behind her, the others slept, curled near saddle blankets, rifles within reach. But Maggie didn't sleep. She watched the horizon instead, waiting for morning, waiting for Silver Falls, and waiting for the reckoning her father had died for.